Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Ashley and my Bigfoot encounter happened when I was 27 years old in 2008. By this time in my life I'd obviously heard about Bigfoot, but I believed that such a creature was just fictitious. I could not believe that something that was not scientifically verified could actually exist. How could it be possible that such a creature could remain in our shadows for so long? And yet there were so many encounters, it all seemed rather bizarre to me, and I'm afraid at the time I was not a believer. I grew up in southern Charleston, West Virginia, which has a rich, vibrant history where Appalachian values run deep. I grew up in an idyllic neighbourhood with my brother Neville and my two parents in a very large, spacious home with exquisite green hills, evergreen lawns, green shrubs and trees. I grew up in a double-storey red-bricked home with a grey roof and white arched windows and large sumptuous entertainment areas where during the summer we would host delicious barbecues and entertain all our friends. I also adored downtown Charleston itself as it's a thriving, vibrant metropolitan destination but with a touch of that small-town flair. Also there are delicious eateries and amazing places to shop there. And as kids we loved socialising in the town centre and meeting up with all our friends for homemade ice creams and double thick malt milkshakes. Charleston is nestled in the Kanawha Valley with the canal and Elk rivers meandering through the rolling hills. And yet only an hour outside Charleston you can really go exploring, hiking, fishing or even whitewater rafting. There is so much outdoor adventuring to do there, and as kids my brother Neville and I were in our element. We adored whitewater rafting, exploring, fishing and camping, which we invariably did quite regularly. I left Charleston after I completed my bachelor's degree in fashion design and was offered an amazing job in Los Angeles as an assistant fashion buyer for an upmarket clothes store, where I worked for 2 long years in central Los Angeles. At the time I lived in a rather small pokey apartment that was so small you could literally swing a cat. My story begins when I decided to take a road trip from California to West Virginia, which would take 4 to 5 days. I was going to my best friend's wedding in West Virginia to be her esteemed maid of honour, so I needed to arrive a day earlier for the wedding. I had not seen my best friend Amanda for over 2 long years, although we did Skype each other very regularly. I had thought about flying out to Virginia at the time, but I decided against it, as I thought it would be infinitely more fun to drive through some enchanting idyllic scenic routes and stop off at different bed and breakfast locations along the way. I enjoyed driving, with one exception of course. I was terrified of driving at night, but I knew if I drove according to my schedules I could avoid that, so I mapped out all the places where I would stop and prepared a great road map for my journey, and I was good to go. As you can imagine, I was so excited about this wedding and returning to my hometown to see my family and friends again and to catch up on all the hometown gossip, as I'd been away so very long. I made sure I packed a sleeping bag, blanket, pillow, flashlight, all the clothes that I would inevitably be needing for my journey, along with a couple of reading books and, of course, food and drink. I left Los Angeles about 9 o'clock in the morning, and after a couple of stops, I drove for about 7 hours straight to the first bed and breakfast where I would be staying. I was greeted by a delightful elderly couple who invited me into their home with such genuine warmth and kindness, and I was beginning to think that I had made a great decision driving instead of flying to West Virginia. I was enjoying the exquisite views and driving through the idyllic North American countryside and meeting such interesting, charming people along the way. It was on the 4th day that things went invariably rather wrong. I left my bed and breakfast at 9 o'clock that morning, very certain that I was going to make good time, but I could not have been more wrong. For the first part of my journey, the heavens opened and it pelted down with rain, and it was so heavy that I barely could see the car in front of me, because the windscreen wipers were not working fast enough to clear the vision for me, which caused me to feel edgy and rather unsettled. Worse still, there was this ominous sound of thunder and flashes of yellow lightning insidiously flashing across the sky, and there was chaotic, disorderly traffic congestion in some of the towns piling up at an alarming rate. I noticed that despite the weather, people were driving haphazardly on the road and taking risks that they could ill afford to take. Imagine my horror when I noticed a young girl in the car next to me, texting as if her life depended on it, and she was paying no attention to the road while the conditions were invariably becoming exceedingly more treacherous. I remember having a foreboding premonition that something very bad was going to happen, and it would seem that I was not wrong. The girl continued to text, and suddenly she put her foot on the accelerator, ploughing through the heavy rain at an excessive speed, overtaking my vehicle and racing recklessly through a red light, where she had a head-on collision with a massive truck, and in seconds I watched in horror as her car plunged straight into the truck at record speed. There was a thunderous crashing metal sound, and the young girl's car was completely obliterated, and when I use the word obliterated, I frankly quite mean it. It was still pouring down hard with rain, and people's headlights were flashing, and cars were stopping as people sprinted to the scene of carnage, and the entire road was taken up by this horrendous, despicable accident. I remember climbing out of my car in a numb state, racing over to the accident scene. I observed that the girl's car was so mangled, battered, crumpled and buckled, and the best way I can describe it is that it looked like it had been pressed through a pulverizer or a crushing machine. The crash was unsurvivable, and it was too awful to comprehend. As I was walking back to my car, I skidded over something lying in the road, and to my horror it was the deceased young girl's hand. I was mortified by such a horrifying discovery. I remember that she'd been smoking with one hand out of the window and texting with the other. I mean, how does one ever drive like that, I wondered, and especially in such problematic conditions. It would seem that the ugly scene unfolding before me was so unbelievably surreal. I felt as if I was playing part in an electrically gripping horror movie. Before long, the police and ambulance had arrived, and by then the rain had reduced to a light, gentle trickle. I watched as the EMT put a blanket over the truck driver's back, who they were treating for shock. The poor pale man had eyes as wide as saucers, and he was shaking so much. He kept crying, "I killed her, I killed her." But everybody was comforting him and reassuring him it wasn't his fault. "Dude, she wasn't concentrating. She drove through a red light. It's hardly your fault. Don't blame yourself for this." I sat in my car, shaking like a leaf, and my anxiety levels were hitting the roof. A policeman was tapping my window. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he said. "You look shaken up." "I'm fine," I said. "Did you see the accident?" he asked curiously. "Quite terrible. You never get used to them, you know. Been an officer for 20 years now, and never get used to the carnage on our roads." "I saw the whole awful thing," I said. "The young girl was texting on her cell phone and smoking at the very same time, and then she ran through a red light at a record speed. It was like a scene from a horror movie." "Silly girl," said the policeman. "Why do they never learn about this texting malarkey? You mark my words, it's more deadly than drink." "And what for, I ask you? A silly little message on Twitter? What a senseless waste. And life can be so brutal." It was a long time before the traffic could actually get moving, and so I put on some relaxing music to calm down my frayed, fragile nerves, and began to make steady progress. But it was growing exceedingly dark, and I'd only managed 5 hours on the road. I was intending to drive for 7.5 hours to get to my bed and breakfast, but I'm too skittish to drive in the dark because I always feel like I'm seeing double. I knew that I did not have much time to lose, and I looked around for somewhere decent to stay, but the only place I could invariably find was in a remote area, looked rather like a seedy motel. In that moment I decided it would just have to do, as there was no way I was going to drive in the dark, and after witnessing that deadly accident, I was exceedingly skittish, so I knew I could do with a good night's sleep. As I entered the lobby, there was a tall, willowy man standing behind the counter, and he surreptitiously gave me the once-over, as if he was marking me out of 10 for my appearance, which sent warning chills racing down my spine. "I'd like a single room for the night," I said. "I have an ID and a card." "No, I only accept cash," he said. Fortunately, I had enough cash on me, and I paid him in full, and then he gave me a key to room 515, pointing to the open back door in the lobby. "Just go through that door," he said. "The room you're looking for is down the passage." I thanked the man and grabbed the key. I could see it was getting dark, and I was relieved to have a place to stay, although it did look remarkably like the Norman Bates Motel. The man who was the psychotic killer who had that fixation with his mother. Remember the one in that movie? Well, this motel enveloped my senses with a similar menacing, inauspicious vibe that had my hair standing on edge. I kept telling myself to stop being so ridiculous. It had been a tough day, and I was imagining all kinds of crazy scenarios, which was hardly surprising, given that I'd been an eyewitness to a tragic car accident. Finally, I came to the room, opened the door, and was horrified at how seedy the place was. It was not even very clean. I turned over the age-soiled mattress that smelt of stale urine, and I pounded a few times with my fist, to be greeted by waves of dust that rose in the air like sandstorms in a desert. I was coughing and spluttering from the dust infusion. Switching the light off, I examined the sheets with my torch, and they were inundated with filthy stains. If things couldn't get worse, they invariably did. I checked the bathroom, and it looked so dingy and nasty that I was almost scared I'd catch some deadly disease off the toilet seat. The final straw was when I noticed some roaches scattered all over the floor, including some rat droppings. There was no way I could stay in this dump, I thought. I decided I'd complain at the desk and insist on a better room or my money back. As I made my way back to the lobby area, the back door was open, so I walked in quietly. The man at the reception booth was on the telephone, but his back was turned away from me, and he immediately got my attention because he was talking about me. There is nothing like hearing someone discussing you to get your attention. "Yes, she's in room 515. I do have a copy of the key. I can give it to you. But I do want $300, yes. Yes, she's a looker. Pretty girl, dark hair, petite. I think she ticks all your boxes. Put it this way, you'll be thanking me afterwards." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Oh my God, I thought, this isn't happening to me. Luckily, all my stuff was in the car, and so I ran stealthily back to my car, jumped on the seat and hightailed it out of the car park, and started up the engine and drove as far away as I could from that God-forsaken motel in the pitch darkness. I was terrified and shaking so much that I must have driven for about 45 minutes straight. I was driving in an area without any cars in sight, passing farmers' fields with rows and rows of corn and the old isolated country barn, but the area was so incredibly quiet that the silence was deafening and very menacing, and I felt very alone, like a little ant in a massive universe, which was a hugely overwhelming and intimidating feeling. I knew I could not drive any further because my nerves were jaded and wearied. Even my eyes were glazing over, starting to see double. Suddenly I came to a very heavily wooded area with a dirt road growing through the woods, and I knew the cover of trees camouflaging my SUV would help me feel safe. I drove my car down the bumpy dirt road through a wooded area where I parked beside a large, majestic-looking oak tree. Feeling exhausted, I climbed into the back of my SUV and got into my sleeping bag, and must have fallen asleep almost immediately, as the effects of the day had worn me out and wearied me desperately. Suddenly I was awoken in the middle of the night to being jolted around in the back of my SUV, and my car was shaking and rattling like a can of sweets. I appeared to be moving backwards and forwards. For a second I thought I was actually being towed away by a truck, because it felt exactly like that. I looked out of the back window of the car to see two strapping, buxom-looking bears carrying my car. I could hardly believe it. I peered ever closer, and I could hear the strange chattering sound that sounded like two people engaging in gibberish, which was decidedly odd, because I was sure it was coming from the bears. I wiggled and manoeuvred my body to the front seat of the car and put on my headlights and sounded my horn very loudly. Suddenly my car was wobbled precariously as it hit the ground with a slight bang, bouncing slightly on its tyres. I clearly had startled the bears by blowing the horn so loudly, I thought. I imagined that they didn't realise that there was anyone or anything in the car. On reflection, I'd never known bears capable of moving a car before, although I had actually observed a black bear smashing out the front window of a car with its own paws in a comedy show once. So I knew that they were powerful animals, but being capable of picking up a car, that was a whole nother story. I never knew they were strong enough for that. I opened the door with my canister of bear spray, ready to spray at the unsuspecting critters, when I realised I was staring at 3 Herculean-sized Bigfoot, and certainly not black bears. Now I was certain I had to be dreaming. My first thought was, "You've got to be kidding me." This was not happening, I thought in bewilderment. It was clear that I had not expected to see a Bigfoot, and nor had they anticipated seeing me. For a second we just stared at each other for a very long time. The creatures must have been about 1,000 pounds, 8 foot tall and 4 foot wide, and they were covered in long, loose, shaggy brown hair, and they had very distinctive cone-shaped heads, long human-like faces, and very visible red eye-shine. I couldn't believe what I was actually seeing. Suddenly I heard what sounded like warning gunshots, and the creatures just glided away very swiftly into the woods the moment they heard the sounds, and they took 5 feet strides, and they sped away with incredible agility and grace, moving their arms backwards and forwards as if they were marching. It would seem that they moved with such majesty and grace. Suddenly I heard someone tapping at the window of my SUV, and there I saw him, a jovial, plump farmer, looking in at me with a concerned look on his face. I could see him clearly because my headlights were still on. "Are you all right, missy?" asked the man. I knew something was happening because my farm dogs were barking non-stop, so I thought I'd see what was going on. "They didn't scare you, did they? The Bigfoot, I mean."
"No," I assured him. "I'm fine." "I'm not sure that you are, miss. You look as white as a sheet. Why don't you follow me back to the farmhouse? The wife will be eager to give you a cup of hot chocolate and a cosy bed to sleep in for the night. I don't like the idea of a young girl like yourself sleeping in your car alone. I couldn't live with myself if anything untoward were to happen to you." Before I knew it, I was actually following this kindly man back to his farmhouse and was being licked to death by his 3 black Labradors who seemed delighted to meet me. "I'd not have known anything was going on out there," said the farmer, "if it wasn't for these incredible dogs of mine. Their senses are extraordinary."
Before long I was being fussed over by a kindly farmer's wife, a lovely lady called Lydia, who presented me with a warm cup of hot chocolate and ushered me into a spare bedroom where I slipped under the cosy, crisp cotton-scented sheets and slept for a very long time. I awoke with the sun dancing through the bedroom windows, and I glanced at my watch and realised it was at least 1 o'clock. I had no idea I'd slept so late. Lydia led me to a bathroom and insisted I had a long soak in a hot bath before lunch. Before long I was sitting around the lunch table eating the most sumptuous home-cooked food, as Lydia was an incredible cook. Before long I began to explain why I'd ended up parking in their woods, and I told them my extraordinary story about the motel, and they suggested I filed a police report, which I of course did. I could not prove anything, as it was all just hearsay. Nevertheless, they took down my details and filed a report. I began to ask the farmer all about the Bigfoot on his land, as I sensed he seemed affiliated with them in some way. He told me that the reason they escorted my car out of the woods because they regarded the wooded area on his property that stretched back for many miles as belonging to them, and my car simply didn't belong in the area. "I'm fine with it," said the farmer. "They keep down the deer population, and I'm grateful for that.
and they're never a bother. If you've never seen one before, it can be terrifyingly daunting experience because those critters are massive, and to think they were carrying your car, it never amazes me how strong they are. They never cease to boggle my mind with their extraordinary strength and power. I can't believe you're talking about them like this, I gasped, because until now I thought they were creatures of fiction. Well, I'd never dream of telling anybody about the Bigfoot on my land, as I respect their privacy and space, so I tend to keep my mouth shut about such matters, for their own protection, of course. I'm sure most people would do the same in the circumstances. It's a little like they're an extension of your own family, as they tend to grow on you. The last thing I'd want is all and sundry investigating the Bigfoot on my land. They are very private creatures, you know, who hate to be bothered, and if they knew people were coming to check them out, they would leave this place faster than greased lightning, I assure you. I've grown up with Bigfoot, said Ed, all my life. Never been a problem to me or a hindrance either, but more like a marvellous help. They leave piles of firewood for us out in the winter, and in turn they have free access to our vegetable beds and fruit trees. It's all like a little unwritten trade-off where both parties concerned benefit. Once or twice a year they leave me a big deer carcass of venison and 2 or 3 large turkeys, which is very good of them. They're intelligent creatures, but very territorial, but they help whenever necessary. You see my Labrador dog over there, Missy? That's her name. One day she fell down a mine shaft, and a Bigfoot pulled her out. They're very good like that. My dogs don't mind them either, although you can smell them a mile off. They pong to high heaven. Lydia would love to get them into the bathtub and give them a right old scrub down, wouldn't you, dear? I'd love to, laughed Lydia, but they'd never ever fit. We'd have to get the fire brigade to dig them out, and they wouldn't be happy about that, she chuckled. We all laughed at Lydia's funny joke. Very intelligent creatures with big hearts, continued Farmer Ed. But I do not see them often because they're quite nocturnal and very elusive, always been very shy and reticent. Isn't that right, Lydia? Oh, very shy, said Lydia, and they can hide from you in plain sight and almost disappear in front of your very eyes. Yet when it's picking season with those fruit trees out there, you'll wake up the next morning and they've picked off piles of the fruit that you couldn't reach from the very top branches, so they instinctively help if they sense you're struggling with something. Wow, I said, do you think if someone tried to attack you on your farm that they would actually protect you? In a heartbeat, said Lydia. They would kill the intruder without a second thought. You mark my words. They regard this land as theirs, and in a way they see us as part of the fixture and fittings of this place. So if someone were to harm us, it would be a direct threat to them. You mean like a pussycat, I laughed. Our cat at home rarely believes she owns us, even though we feed her and take care of her all the time. My mother says it's like she rarely believes that she's the boss and we're her property. It's just like that, giggled Lydia. Maybe they think they own us. I decided to spend another night with Lydia and Ed because I didn't want to drive so late in the day, but the following morning I left at first light and made it to my best friend's wedding in time and was once again reunited with my family members for a very emotional reunion and a very memorable and special wedding where I enjoyed being the maid of honour. As you can imagine, this was a road trip I will never forget in a hurry. And all these years later, I often spend holidays with Lydia and Ed, who are now the godparents of my firstborn son, Nathaniel. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention that awful man from the motel is currently serving a 20-year prison sentence, but I'm not sure what he was charged with, but I can only imagine. All I know is that the police wanted me to ID him as the man I heard discussing me on the phone to a customer, as if I was something he was planning to sell. It disgusts me to even think about it today. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Cale and my Bigfoot encounter happened to me in 1989 when I was a young boy of only 12 years old. I grew up in the university town of Eugine, a beautiful part of Oregon that is nestled in the valley and is surrounded by dreamy forests of tall, majestic, towering trees, silvery lakes, and the most idyllic panoramic exquisite views. The town itself is full of bicycles parked everywhere, on sidewalks and under large trees, because of the local university and all the students that live in the area. Our town is well renowned for the arts,
and has an artistic flair and feel about it, with the quaint shops and charming little coffee shops. My mother was a local artist at the time, and my dad a university professor at the University of Oregon. Quite literally, we have the best of everything in this part of the world, which is why I would never live anywhere else in the entire universe. We are quite literally a quick drive from the exquisite Pacific Ocean, with its masterful, huge foaming white breakers, rugged outcrops and superb sandy beaches. And then to the east and west, we have the pyramid-shaped mountains and the emerald green forests of the Cascade Range. Also on the plus side, I would describe our winter and summer temperatures here as really rather moderate, as winter low temperatures are possibly in the 30s, and high summer temperatures are in the 80s, which for me I personally like, because I'm not a big fan of intense heat or excessive extreme cold. We have so many areas in Eugene from the outdoor enthusiast to explore, like hiking trails and paths, and there are mountains to climb and opportunities for fishing, camping and even skiing. If you're a foodie, Eugene has everything to offer, from fine dining with chefs producing masterful French cuisine, and then the food trucks here that are always a huge hit for the university students, because the food is delicious, tasty, but cheap and fast. I grew up in a very traditional looking white house with a grey slate roof, manicured lawns, fenced in backyard, in a prime location close to the university. I grew up with my brother Titus, who was 13 at the time, and my mother and dad, and we had an idyllic childhood, riding our bicycles in the area, throwing bread for the ducks in the lake, and going hiking, camping and exploring in the woods. It was a fabulous lifestyle. My story begins when one day after my brother and I had returned from school and my mother was preparing a snack for us in the kitchen, suddenly we heard a knock at the door, and my brother and I heard my mother talking to a young girl at the front door, and then she welcomed this strange woman into our home. I noticed that she was a very pretty girl, with long blonde hair and blue eyes. My mother immediately told my brother and I to go to our bedrooms, while she bustled around the kitchen, making coffee for her guest. The strange, mysterious young woman, who sat at the kitchen table, was twiddling her thumbs very nervously, and looking around the kitchen awkwardly, taking everything in with a keen, interested look. My brother and I were so curious, because it was not every day that a pretty young girl came to visit us, and we were very eager to know who she was and why she was randomly visiting my mother like this just out of the blue. I wonder what she wants, I said to Titus. I'm going to find out, I told him. I'll fill you in with the details, unless, of course, she's just wanting to be sponsored for a charity run. I tiptoed through the passage and stood behind a pillar in the open-plan kitchen area, where I knew I would not be observed. What is this about? I heard my mother say. I'm Anna, by the way. Yes, I know who you are. Edward has told me all about you. I'm Gillian. You know my husband, I heard my mother saying, sounding rather surprised. Yes, I know him very, very well, if you know what I mean, the girl insinuated, looking at my mum with an intense expression on her face. No, I heard my mother say. Sorry, but I don't know what you mean. Please elaborate. Your husband and I have been having a steamy affair, she said, with a rather joyful tone to her voice. In that moment you could have cut the silence with a knife. In that second I was so sick to my stomach with nausea and disgust. My father, the man I aspired and looked up to as a man of such integrity and honour, had now fallen down the ladder of my high estimations. This was not possible, I thought. My father would never do this to my mother. He loved the bones of her, and she was his world. Furthermore, he was always telling her that, and they were very much in love. None of this made any sense whatsoever. What on earth was going on? I heard my mother gasping. You're having an affair with my husband, she repeated, rolling the words at the back of her tongue, as if trying to decipher what they actually meant. But you're so young. You're only a kid. How long has this been going on? For 2 months, said the girl. I'm one of his students, and by the way, I'm not a kid, she said defensively. I think you are, and you're very young, I assure you. My husband isn't the type to have an affair, she said. He would never jeopardize his job at the university. But more to the point, why are you telling me this? Asked my mother.
Because your stupid husband does not want to leave you, nor does he want to leave your kids, she snapped. But I think once you know what's going on with your husband, you'll want to leave him. I'm sure of that. I would never leave my husband, my mother snapped. Never, never, never. Now get out of here, she demanded. I had never ever heard my mother raise her voice to anyone before, and I could hear the young woman scamper away. I'll make sure he leaves you, she called out, as the front door was slammed behind her. Just you watch me, see if I don't. I stood there in absolute horror as I watched my mother pacing up and down the kitchen with such a horrified look on her face, and she seemed to be crying. I raced back to my bedroom to tell my brother everything that I had just heard. We were absolutely gutted that my father could have done this to my mother. No, it can't be true, insisted Titus. The girl is young enough to be Dad's daughter, and it's a sick joke, surely. Dad would never do this to Mum. She sounded pretty certain that she'd been cheating with Dad, I told him. That's disgusting, said Titus. I'm going to kill Dad for this. Do you suppose the girl could be making up tall stories, I suggested. For what? I said, Titus. Why would she benefit from doing that? What purpose would she gain? Because she's sick in her head and has a crush on Dad, and maybe he didn't respond to her advances, and so she's seeking revenge, I suggested. First of all, I want to explain that my mother and Dad have always had a loving relationship, and they have never raised their voices to each other before. And neither of us had any idea whether my mother had actually confronted my dad about the strange girl's allegations of an affair. Surprisingly enough, my brother and I held our tongues about what we'd witnessed, as we didn't want to throw accusations at my dad until we really knew what was going on. One thing was very certain, and that was things became very difficult in our formerly loving household that was normally filled with joyful laughter and exciting banter. Not any more. I think our parents tried to pretend that things were normal, but the silence in our home was deafening, and I could see my mother was never ever smiling, and was so emotionally distant and disconnected with my father. And if he reached out to so much as touch her in a loving way, she would physically push him away with a look of disgusted revulsion on her face. Any conversations that were ever articulated around the dinner table revolved around us with questions like, "How was netball today? And did you finish your math homework? And please will you pass the pepper?" I would notice this very sad look in my dad's despairing blue eyes, and it would seem that my father's formal ravenous appetite had all but reduced to that of a sparrow, and my mother would go through the motions of eating, but she would just play with her food and look down on her dinner plate with an aggrieved look on her face. Another bizarre thing happened around our home, and that was my mother's cheerful artwork took on an ominously dark turn, and all her paintings became dark, oppressive and sinister-looking, painted in blazing colours of reds and blacks. And they were creepy and horrible, which I know now was an expression of the inner turmoil and anger that she was feeling at the time, that was being expressed on the canvas. Put it this way, the work was good if you're into the occult and like dramatic, depressingly heinous, ugly work. And when my father saw her latest artwork, I actually heard him gasp and say, "What the heck?" One evening when my mother and Dad were sitting down at the table for dinner, she announced that my brother and I would be going to boarding school for a while. I knew at once that our parents wanted us out of the house because of their tumultuous marriage, and they didn't want us to be eyewitness to their angry outbursts. "I'm not going," I protested. "I don't want to go to boarding school." "Neither do I," snapped Titus. "I refuse to go. I like being at home. Why do you want to send us away anyway? Don't you love us any more?" "Oh, darling," said my mother, putting a gentle hand on Titus's shoulder, which he shook off with anger. "Don't touch me, Mum," he said, storming out of the dining room and kicking the chair violently. "Do not think I don't know what's going on here. We are not as ignorant or as stupid as you both think we are. This is all about you, not about us. You're grown-ups. Fix your problems." That night, Titus and I discussed long and hard about what we should do about our current precarious situation. Neither of us wanted to go to boarding school. Our cousin was a boarder, and he had told us terrible tales about the master there, beating their backsides so hard that he claimed he couldn't walk for an entire week afterwards, and sometimes in his spaghetti he had found roaches.
Worse still, it would seem that after dinner they would spend a couple of hours doing homework before going to bed. It couldn't get worse than that, could it? "We're not going, as simple as that," said Titus. "We've got no choice in the matter," I said. "We have to do what Mum and Dad want us to do." "Not necessarily," said Titus. "I have other plans in mind." "Such as what?" I asked. "We're going to run away and camp out in the woods to register our protest." "Mum and Dad will send out a search party to look for us," I protested. "Don't be so naive," little brother teased Titus. "They won't want anyone to know about us running away. They'll look for us themselves, because if anything were to come out about Dad's alleged affair with a student, bang goes his job with the university. So they'll keep everything very hush-hush. Besides, they don't want their dirty linen aired and exposed for all to see." "Good point," I said. "But if they do find us, what is the point of running away in the first place?" I asked, looking confused. "Because, brother," said Titus, grinning, "we will threaten to run away again and again, until they agree not to send us to boarding school." I looked at my brother in awe. No wonder he got straight A's in everything at school. He rarely knew how to think outside the box, and this was a cunning, clever, thought-out plan. Fast forward to our first night spent camping. We found an idyllic place to hitch our tent in an open wooded clearing close to a meandering pebbly stream that trickled through the valley. For some strange reason I was really feeling extremely excited. My parents were both tucked in bed, oblivious to the fact that we were no longer in the house with them, and it felt brilliant to be out on our own like this. It was such an exquisitely beautiful night, and the light of the pearly luminescent full moon and the silver jewel-like stars illuminated the clearing with such a soft, gentle light, and we could hear the strong, pulsating current of flowing water crashing over the large moss-covered boulders. It was so enchanting out here like this, and we happily prepared our fire pit, where we boiled a pot of steaming hot water and made ourselves delicious cups of piping hot chocolate, and we roasted marshmallows over the golden flames of the crackling fire. It didn't get better than this. "We don't camp enough," I said happily to my brother. "This is so cool being out here like this, listening to the water and studying the stars in the firmament." We observed a phenomenal-looking owl gliding towards the ground and grabbing a mouse in his sharp talons. We watched him in awe, returning to a branch and tearing the flesh in his claws, which he ate in his beak. Even if we knew we were watching him, he didn't seem bothered or remotely fazed at all. We also saw a couple of raccoons scampering away from us. I threw a couple of marshmallows in their direction, which they grabbed quickly and scurried away to eat from a very far distance. That night we retired to our sleeping bags in our cosy tent. I found it incredibly difficult to get to sleep for a long while, as I kept tossing and turning in my sleeping bag, feeling incredibly worried about how my mother would react when she found our beds empty in the morning. I knew she would be utterly devastated, and I began to feel incredibly guilty about what my brother and I had actually done. For a while I fell asleep, but I had an ongoing nightmare of my mother screaming when she discovered our tent in the woods, which appeared empty in my dream. She was howling in despair, and so the guilt about what my brother and I had done hounded me incessantly, like a frustrating buzzing fly that just wouldn't leave me alone. I wanted to wake up Titus to express my misgivings about what we'd done, running off like this, but I knew he'd start accusing me of being a huge big baby, and so I said nothing and held my tongue. I decided to take a brisk walk around the clearing, just so I could get my head straight and stop worrying about my mother. I needed to talk myself round from being too sensitive about these matters, or I'd never get any sleep. I was standing in the clearing, only about 100 yards from the tent where my brother was sleeping, when I noticed a lone coyote who was staring at me. And before I knew it, I was surrounded by these things, and they were ambushing me from every angle and side, and there must have been over a dozen of them. Where had they come from, I wondered in horror, for a long while. It seemed so surreal, as if I was in some kind of strange dream, from which I hope I would awaken. I rubbed my eyes, only to realise that I was well and truly awake, and was indeed surrounded by these coyotes, but they were regarding me with a ravenous, hungry intent. I knew they were planning to tear me to pieces, limb from limb. I screamed out to my brother for help. "Titus, help! Titus, help! Help, Titus! Help! Help!" I screamed over and over again,
But he did not come to my rescue. What on earth was wrong with my brother, I wondered furiously. I knew at the very best of times he was a deep sleeper, but surely he would have heard me by now and shoot these coyotes. Go away, I said to them, go away! But the creatures ventured ever closer, and they were getting bolder and bolder as they circled me with a very fixed, focused and determined gaze. It would seem that nothing would deter them from their eager quest to take me down. I was in very serious trouble, and if my brother didn't help me soon, I was a goner. I knew that for sure. Suddenly I heard this thunderous noise that came tearing through the woods like a steam train on full throttle. At this time of the night it sounded airily supernatural. Then I saw it, emerging from the shadows like a black ghostly spectre, and bolting towards these coyotes was this massive, hairy, humanoid ape-like creature, the likes of such as I've never ever seen before. The creature lunged towards the pack of coyotes, grabbing one, while the others scattered away in terror. I watched in utter horror as the strange critter tossed the coyote in the air as if he was a spinning wheel. The coyote was terrified and made a yelping sound, and then the hairy humanoid creature swung it in the air like a cricket bat and blasted its head so hard against a tree trunk until it lay limp in his hands. I saw two coyotes watching the scene unfold from a distance away, and they scurried away, faster than greased lightning. I wondered if this mysterious creature, whatever in God's name it was, intended to kill me as well. My heart was thumping violently in my chest, and I could feel the vibration. I was so frozen in terror as I observed this colossal-sized being. It was light enough to get a good view of the creature, but not light enough to give you intricate details about his appearance. But I do know this. The critter had to be male because he had a powerful, assertive male energy and a dominant, imposing demeanour. I'd say he was about 1,000 pounds, 9 foot tall and 4 foot wide, and his dark silhouette was distinctly humanoid, but there were aspects of his anatomy that reminded me of a great ape. It was a thick, muscular, burly giant. It had much longer arms than a human would have, and was covered in long, flowing hair, which appeared to be very dark, but I couldn't detect the exact colour or shade. It had a cone-shaped, very distinctive head, and deep-set eyes that gave off a rather menacing red eye-shine, which was exceedingly intimidating. The creature looked at me for a second, then tossed the dead coyote onto the ground, as if it was disgusting, and then he glided away into the woods with a seamless grace. It was in that moment that I realised that this strange, curious creature, which I now know to be a Bigfoot, had actually answered my screams and saved my life. I was amazed. I was also surprised that it didn't take the coyote off with him to eat, but I really got the sense that the creature did not like these coyotes. For some reason they got on his nerves, and he despised them, so I imagined eating them was not up his alley. I rushed into my tent and tried to wake up my brother, who grumbled in irritation as I woke him up. "I was just dreaming about you," he said to me. "You were screaming for my help, and I came to your rescue." "That was me," I said, "and it wasn't a dream, and that's the problem. You didn't come to my rescue. I was in trouble. I called out for help, and you failed to respond. I could have been eaten alive by coyotes tonight if it hadn't been for a colossal ape-like creature." I proceeded to tell my brother exactly what had transpired, but he didn't believe a word of it. "Stop talking nonsense, brother," he said. "Your imagination is playing tricks on you. You were clearly also dreaming." I was soon to learn that no one was to believe my story, so I decided from that moment on to keep my mouth firmly shut. It would seem that my brother's strategy about camping out in the woods to prevent us from going to boarding school invariably did the trick. And better than that, the sheer horror of finding my brother and I missing literally brought my mother and dad together as a forceful team, determined to find us without involving the police. I'm glad to inform you that we did confront my parents about the allegations of my dad having an affair with this young girl called Gillian, and it turned out that Gillian had thrown herself at my dad, and he had rejected her advances, so she made up the affair to get her revenge, and we were to find out later that she had tried this trick on multiple college professors and had subsequently visited their wives, as she had done my mother. I think she enjoyed being a wolf among the pigeons and causing trouble wherever she went. They said it was because she was miserable and wanted everybody else to feel as miserable as she did. My father described Gillian as a vindictive marriage wrecker of the worst possible kind, especially because she was lying through her teeth in every case, apart from one professor who sadly did fall for her advances, which ultimately destroyed his reputation, career and marriage, which had been her vindictive intention all along. I learnt that my father was very upset that my mother had believed in the false allegations in the very first place, so in the end things turned out very well for our entire family, and on cue again there was joyful laughter and cheerful banter in our home again. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Ben, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1994 when I was 14 years old. I grew up with my parents and my sister Abby in a small rural town in the Pacific Northwest, where my father worked as a local mechanic while my mother stayed at home taking care of us. But she did actually have a small business that she ran on the side, where she made personalised cakes, baked goods and breads on order for people, sometimes even for special occasions or for someone's Sunday barbecue. She was an excellent baker. Growing up, I don't recall a time when our house did not actually smell like a delicious bakery, as there were always the most delectable buttery melt-in-the-mouth smells of cinnamon buns or vanilla sponge cake, homemade bread or cheese scones wafting in the air and infusing the entire house with the most appetising smells. Even today I always feel nostalgic when I pass a bakery and smell cinnamon buns, because those smells always remind me of home. One day my parents decided to move to an area not far from our original farmhouse, and they purchased a sizable 1800s farmhouse on about an acre of land that was situated on a large gravel road with close neighbours on either side of our home. The house on one side of the gravel road were all flanked by tall majestic trees that spread out into an area of large national forest, which, although public land, was accessible to us because there were numerous hiking trails in the area. This wooded retreat was an idyllic haven for the indigenous wildlife in the area that would often be seen scampering across our lawns in the late evening or early mornings, especially during times when our seasonal apples and pears were on offer and had fallen from the trees to the floor, as the deers enjoyed eating the fallen fruit on the ground. As kids, we were so excited to move into our new home that was so picture perfect and was nestled in the lush green valley, surrounded by the dreamy forests and mountainous views of rugged outcrops and pyramid-shaped mountains that towered up in the blue-grey firmament like majestic masterpieces of nature. Fortunately, our home had been recently renovated by the original owner, but the integrity of the original farmhouse had still been maintained, although invariably modern influences had been added, as all the rooms in our house were very airy and spacious, with large picture windows that overlooked the most sumptuous, exquisite views. The kitchen in our home was literally legendary and was the most phenomenal room in the entire home that you would want to spend your time in because it was so cosy. It was huge and spacious, with extensive granite surfaces, incredible stylish kitchen sinks and taps, not to mention the state-of-the-art prodigious pale green range oven, designed especially for someone who has a flair for cooking. It was the kind of awe-inspiring kitchen you would inevitably expect someone like the master chefs like Gordon Ramsay or Barefoot Contessa or Martha Stewart to own. No sooner had we moved into our sumptuous, cosy new dwelling, we had a mysterious elderly visitor who turned up at our house unannounced and was reluctantly bustled into the kitchen by my mother. I remember she was a peculiar, decrepit old woman that looked so withered and emaciated and frail, and her small shrunken face looked as wrinkled and weathered as a tortoise, and her torso was virtually folded over her walking stick as she walked slowly into our kitchen, dragging one of her legs behind her as she walked with a very awkward limp. When she sat down on the kitchen chair, it was like every single bone in her body cracked, and as she spoke, her voice was like a low guttural rasp. "I think I should warn you," she said. "Never go into those woods." She was pointing with a gnarled hand towards the direction of the forest that flanked our home. "There are things in there," she said, with her eyes growing as wide as saucers. "Things in there that are not of this world. Things you don't want to mess with." "Sorry," said my mother, "but what exactly are you saying? I don't really understand." Big monsters, said the woman. I'm just warning you of such things, because your children could be in very grave danger. I've said all I need to say, and I'm going now, she rasped. And slowly she manoeuvred her body over her walking stick in an agonizingly slow, methodical process, until finally she climbed into the car seat of the waiting car, where she was driven away by her driver.
Who the heck is that? Asked my dad, coming into the kitchen. And what was all that talk about monsters? Some batty old lady, said my mother. Nothing for you to worry about, darling. I think she's as nutty as a fruitcake. You know the type. She was warning us about monsters over there in the woods. Talk about being completely bonkers. What utter nonsense some people talk. My father laughed. She looked as if she came from a mental asylum, he said. And that's being kind. What balderdash! There's nothing dangerous about that wooded area, for goodness sake. It's accessible to hikers and dog walkers, and it's a perfectly safe retreat. Granted, you might get a coyote or a bobcat from time to time, but during the day those kind of predators, I think they stay clear of humans. Exactly right, reflected my mother. Still, you have to admit it's rather odd her visiting us like this out of the blue. I've no idea who on earth she is, because I've never ever seen her before in our part of the world. It's decidedly odd. Soon the episode with the strange old woman had all but been forgotten, and as kids we were actively encouraged to play outdoors, especially when my mother was busying herself baking in the kitchen and wanted us out of her hair. My sister and I loved hanging out in the woods because it was so lovely and peaceful in there, and the trees were so tall and imposing, with colossal trunks that towered up in the sky like masterful green giants. My sister and I adored touching the moss-covered trunks and feeling the rough bark under our fingertips, because the trees were well over 300 years old, and when you touched them it was like you were picking up the energy of former generations that had frequented the woods long before we were ever born. That was a very sobering thought. The forest consisted of indigenous red alders, spruce, hemlock and Douglas fir trees, and its sweeping floor was covered in pretty green foliage, and there were long, clear, man-made dirt trails for walkers or cyclists to go and explore. So occasionally we did encounter a dog walker or a lone jogger in the woods. There was also a stream that zigzagged through the area and even accessed the far end of our neighbour's property. So when our cranky avant-garde neighbour was not around, we invariably enjoyed paddling in the stream and throwing pebbles into the water. The crotchety neighbour was a cantankerous, fractious man who was in his late 40s, but very grumpy, peevish and bad-tempered, and he would always shout at us if he ever caught us playing on his land. It was clear he hated and despised kids, but my mother told us that he was never congenial to any of the locals in the town, and was pretty rude to almost everyone he met. One day my sister and I learnt that he'd recently got married to a mail-order Russian bride that he'd surreptitiously brought back from Russia to North America, and we had heard that she could barely speak a word of English. My mother wasn't surprised that he'd gone to Russia looking for love, because she said there was unlikely to be a single girl in America that would be willing to marry the condescending, ill-humoured bully. When my father had asked him in a chance encounter what married life was actually like, he told my father that Russian girls were good because they knew their place in their home, were domesticated, and my father discerned from the anomalous, peculiar revelation that the poor girl probably waited on his every need, hand and foot. My sister and I were so curious to see what this Russian girl was actually like, because our tetchy, horrible neighbour pretty much kept her hidden away in his home, far from the prying, gossiping and speculative eyes of the townsfolk. So one day my sister and I tiptoed past the stream and hid behind a boxwood bush in the neighbour's yard, in very close proximity to his open-plan house, to see if we could see the Russian girl from the glass-sliding windows of the living area. It would seem that our wish was actually granted, because we witnessed the pretty Russian girl coming out into the yard and hanging a whole bundle of washing on the line. We noticed that her arctic blue eyes were so red as if she'd been crying, and she seemed pale and emaciated, and her blonde hair hung in a lifeless heap on her shoulders, and it looked as shabby and wretched as she did. The only way I can describe her appearance to you is like a pretty apple blossom tree that had been planted in poor soil, so she looked faded, undernourished, and lacking that healthy youthful radiance you would expect to usually see in a young girl of her age. I could tell at once that this poor girl looked desperately sad, and furthermore she was easily 20 years younger than our neighbour, which meant he had married someone half his age. We could hear the loud booming voice of our grumpy neighbour coming from inside the house. "I cannot find my socks," he screamed, and the frightened girl ran into the house to rectify and redeem the situation. My sister and I stared at each other in astonishment as we heard this huge commotion going on in the neighbour's house, and we could hear this thrashing sound and the agonising screams from the young woman, as if she was being beaten up by this hostile, vindictive, cold-hearted man. "I told you he was nasty," I told my sister. "He's clearly beating up the poor girl. I bet she wished she'd never come to America." Over the next few weeks, my sister and I spied on our neighbour to keep an eye on the poor Russian girl, as we felt incredibly sorry for her being married to that awful man. Over and over again we would hear raised voices and female cries, almost as if she was in distress, until one day the volatile voices stopped completely. We never saw the young Russian girl ever again after that. That was when I was almost certain that our neighbour had murdered her, especially when I went through his dumpster to look for some evidence, only to discover that Mr. Wolf, our neighbour, had surreptitiously thrown away some woman's clothes, handbags and other female items that I knew must have belonged to her. As far as I was concerned, it was all incredibly suspicious. Why would he be discarding her stuff like this, I wondered. Of course, when you're a young kid, you're never taken very seriously by your parents, so when Abby and I told our parents that the neighbour had murdered the Russian girl next door and stuffed her clothes in the dumpster, my parents only laughed at us and told us to stop being so dramatic. "You know what Mr. Wolf is like," she told us. "He's a miserable old man that's keeping that poor Russian girl squirreled away in the house so that the gossips don't have a field day discussing her. I gather he took her to Las Vegas recently for a few days, far away from the prying eyes of the townsfolk. If she's thrown anything away in the dumpster, I wouldn't worry about it at all. It's possibly because he brought her a whole new wardrobe while she was in Las Vegas. I'm sure he spoilt her rotten when they stayed at the Waldorf Astoria. Lucky thing! I wish your father would do something romantic like that and take me to Las Vegas." I wasn't convinced my parents were right, but when my dad had bumped into Mr. Wolf shortly after my conversation with my mother, he surreptitiously asked after his Russian bride. Apparently Mr. Wolf had said that things had conked out and that she'd finally returned home to Russia. My father had expressed how sorry he was, but Mr. Wolf had said that being married to a Russian had been a living nightmare. Very difficult woman, he conveyed. Very strong opinions about absolutely everything. Don't ever marry a Russian, let me tell you. When my mother heard about the Russian girl and that she'd absconded back to Russia, she said, "Who can blame the poor girl fleeing back to Russia? I mean, she came to America for a brand new life out here, and the vile man hid her away from everyone in the town. He's a cantankerous, miserable sod, and quite frankly, she's well rid of him." Fast forward a few weeks, and life had gone by speedily, and during a hot summer's day, my sister Abby and I decided to play in the woods, because it was so cool in there, and we could get some welcome relief from the sweltering heat that had hit everybody in our small town exceedingly hard, and one elderly lady we knew about had actually passed away from sunstroke. It was a very bad heat wave that had left tempers frayed and people on edge. Even my normally efficient mother could not bear being anywhere near her oven range, because the heat inside there was just too terrible, so people were actually ordering ice cream from her instead of cakes, because she was refusing to bake. "Let's go to the stream," my sister suggested, but not to the area that meanders through Mr. Wolf's land. We knew that it would require a little further walking to get to that part of the stream where the water was invariably deeper and so much more refreshing. We would have a little dip in the water once we got there to cool ourselves down, and then we would make our way back home. When we finally reached the stream after a long, tiring, rather brisk walk, we saw someone peculiar wearing a fur suit standing in the water, and the first thing my sister Abby said was, "What the heck? Who in their right mind wears a fur coat in weather as swelteringly hot as this?" We watched as the person sat in the water until his fur coat was completely drenched by the cooling water of the gushing stream, and that was when we realised that we were indeed observing a very hairy human being, and not someone bathing in a fur coat. Obviously, this human being had a huge problem with excessive hair growth. I recall having heard about a problem like this before, which only affects a couple of people in several million in the world. I think I heard about the condition somewhere on Mr. Wibley's Believe It or Not, or something like that. We ventured ever closer to the water, and the person looked up at us in surprise, and that was when we realised that this was not a person at all, but a creature of some kind, but what it was, we couldn't imagine. It was about 4 feet tall, lanky and muscular, with very overlong arms and a cone-shaped head. The creature looked at us curiously, regarding us through large golden brown eyes, and we stood there on the rocky embankment, watching him for a while, and then he continued to submerge his body in water. We felt strangely self-conscious by the creature's presence, but he seemed unperturbed by us, and he ignored us, and after a while we went to the edge of the stream, where we cooled ourselves down in the soothing water, all the while keeping our beady eyes pinned on this mysterious creature that seemed surprisingly unfazed by our presence. "What do you think he is?" Abby asked me curiously. "He looks like an ape boy." "Never seen anything like him before," I said. Before I knew it, the critter in the water started to engage with us by projecting a small piece of driftwood towards us, as if he was throwing a ball. Before we knew it, all three of us were playing together and throwing the driftwood backwards and forwards to each other, as if the driftwood was a soccer ball of some kind. And we were having so much fun that after a while the awkward reticence and painful shyness that we invariably initially felt all but dissipated and was overcome, and it was as if we were playing with another kid of our own age, and Abby and I were both warming to the creature immeasurably, who seemed very congenial and very interactive. Suddenly we heard this thunderous commotion, and the hairy critter seemed to grow very apprehensive and alarmed, looking at us with an expression of agitated consternation on his leathery grey face. Before I knew it, he physically, literally pushed us under the large rocky overhang that overlapped the edge of the stream. It was like an invisible ceiling that covered you, and in the little hollow alcove we were very well hidden. We heard this mighty booming sound getting ever closer and closer to us, and it was almost like the ground was experiencing a mini earthquake because it vibrated and shook. Then emerging through the brush and standing over the rocky embankment, we observed the most colossal critter you could ever imagine possible. He was Herculean in size, a giant-sized version of the little critter that we had encountered, but this thing would have made a grizzly bear look very small. At a speculative guess, I would say that this titanic-sized beast was easily over 1,000 pounds, 11 foot tall and 4 foot wide, covered in shaggy brown hair. I knew at once why the critter had hidden us from this monstrous being, whom I realised at once had to be his dad. We watched in stupefied horror as the strange creature spoke in a peculiar gibberish language to his son, in a raised tone of voice that was of a very angry, aggrieved father. He dashed down towards the water's edge and dragged his son out with his overlong arms, and continued to assault him with a barrage of very annoyed-sounding gibberish. We could see that the poor critter's father was indeed a very big bully, and the little critter hung his head in shame as if he'd been well and truly reprimanded. He did not dare say a thing back to his dad, but kept his head lowered to the ground in a very submissive position, which seemed to calm down the feisty, agitated male. I knew at once, if the creature had seen us, his poor little sprog would have invariably been in heaps more trouble. I would go so far as to say that, should that big creature have actually encountered us, he may have indeed caused us grievous bodily harm, if he'd actually seen us, that is. Abby and I were terrified of the large hairy humanoid, and I could even hear my sister's heart pounding violently in her chest as she clung tightly to me under the rocky overhang, drenched in beads of her own sweat. I was too shocked by what I was seeing to be remotely afraid, but believe me, for a long time after that event, I would suffer from delayed anxiety on multiple occasions. It was only later that I recalled my mother receiving that strange elderly guest in our home, soon after we'd moved in, who had actually warned us of monsters in the woods. I now knew what she was talking about, because this large hairy monster was a very definite threat. Fast forward a few more weeks, and Abby and I played out in the woods in our usual spot, far away from the area that we had encountered the formidable beast. We were sad, though, not to encounter the little critter again. We never told our parents about the experience because they would never ever have believed our crazy stories about monstrous hairy humanoids roaming the woods. One day, I kid you not, my dad literally returned from town to tell us some terrible tragic news. He told us that a dog walker had actually found Mr. Wolf's dead body upstream in a deeper part of the area. The news gets worse, said my dad, looking very solemn. Right now, Mr. Wolf's house is surrounded by flashing police cars, and the woods are literally crawling with police. They're absolutely everywhere. Are they looking for the perpetrator of this grisly crime? Asked my mother, looking appalled. Please don't tell me that. Don't tell me that the murderer is camping out in the woods. That's it. They think that it wasn't a human that killed Mr. Wolf, but a very powerful, strong bear that was wandering around the woods in the late hours of the night and has long since vacated the area. My mother looked aghast. More to the point, she said, what was Mr. Wolf doing wandering around the woods in the late hours of the night? It would seem that Mr. Wolf was found lying close to a grave that he'd dug, which was next to a black bin bag, and the bin bag was full of human bones. My mother gasped. No, she said, surely not. I'm afraid it's true. It would seem that his Russian bride did not get to go back to Russia after all, as we falsely believed. No, he shot her at point-blank range in the head, and then he left her in a bin bag in his attic until she became a bag of bones. So we've been living next door to a decaying corpse. Surely someone would have smelt the body, said my mother. Really, said my dad, like who? Nobody visits the miserable old sod. Well, what about the milkman or the postman? Well, I can't answer that, said my father, but it would appear that once her body was a pile of bones, that was when she was easy to transport. So that's when he slipped up to the more remote part of the woods in the dead of night and was subsequently killed by a raging bear. Well, I can't say I feel sorry for him. The man's a savage murderer. He killed that poor innocent Russian girl. See, I told you, I said. I told you he killed the girl. Remember, I found the dumpster filled with all her clothes, and I told you that she'd vanished into thin air, and neither of you would listen to me. Well, it seems you were right, said my mother, but you never ever imagine that you'll ever end up living next door to a killer. That's always something that happens to somebody else. It's in books or movies, or to other people, but not to people like us, surely not. That's what they all say, reflected my dad. But why ever not? Why not us? It could happen to anyone. It took a while for our town to comprehend the bitter and ugly truth behind Mr. Wolf's mail-order Russian bride, but like all stories, it was soon forgotten. But Abby and I never forgot that horrifying event. It was only a few years later that we realised that the hairy critters that we encountered in the woods were in fact Bigfoot, and I know for a fact that like humans, you get good Bigfoot and bad Bigfoot, and the little critter was so lovely, he fits the mould of being a really good Bigfoot, but his dad was a very dangerous, formidable beast, whom I do believe was responsible for killing Mr. Wolf. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Hector, and although I'm a bona fide American, I was actually born in England and grew up in the 80s era. My father was temporarily posted to London for a brief assignment that ended up lasting 12 long years, so invariably the first 10 years of my life was spent in England, until my parents finally returned home to North America, which was where I had my Bigfoot encounter at the young age of 18. I grew up in the English countryside in a quaint English Berkshire village, which was about 10 miles from Windsor, 35 miles from London, 4 miles from Wokingham, and 7 miles from Henley-on-Thames. I grew up in a Grade 2 listed property on over an acre of land, and the picturesque farmhouse was exceedingly old, but had been restored to its original pristine condition. The house itself was very wholesome, with a whimsical fairy tale charm, and was considered an architecture's treasure. It was built from stone, red brick, stucco and wood, and was surrounded by emerald green, pristinely manicured lawns, beds of exquisite rambling roses, hollyhocks, larkspur, daisies, beautiful blue delphiniums, and deep red hardy geraniums. There was a scattering of tall tarry oaks, and on one side of the property was an orchard of apple trees. The inside of our home was very sumptuous and cosy, with oak timber floors and beautiful doors with timber beam accents, both on ceilings and walls. There was a grand ornate oak staircase that led to the upper floors of our home, and then there was a huge stone fireplace in virtually every room of the entire house. I had an idyllic childhood playing with the village kids and attending the local school there, while my father commuted to London every day, which was an hour each way from Wokingham to London Waterloo. I remember when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I became very aware that we were not alone in our home, and that was when my first introduction to the paranormal was born. Every night I would hear these airy footsteps quickly pacing up and down our wooden floors at night, and rushing up and down the staircase very quickly in a hurried way, almost as if someone was in a frantic rush. As a kid, it was absolutely terrifying for me to hear these spooky, anomalous sounds, and when I began to tell my mother that someone was walking around our home at night, she assured me that old houses were notorious for making strange noises. I was not convinced, because I knew I was hearing very distinct footsteps walking up and down those creaky floorboards. One night I looked up from my bed, as I thought my mother had entered my bedroom. I witnessed my door handle twisting spookishly until finally the door creaked open, making an ominous squeaky sound that scared the living daylights out of me. "Mum, is that you?" I called out uneasily from my bed, but there was no answer. I remember staring at the door and feeling certain that someone invisible or a spectral figure was there watching me. I could sense those ethereal eyes gazing at me. For a while all was very still and quiet, and I could hear the sound of heavy feet walking suddenly across my room to the very side of my bed, where the footsteps suddenly just stopped. I remember I sat there, frozen to the spot, with my hair standing on end, as I felt a very formidable, somewhat menacing presence standing close by my bed, staring at me. Yet I saw absolutely nothing. The air in my room became very icy and cold, and I began to shiver violently. "Who's there?" I called out. "Who's there? Who is there?" But there was no answer, and my voice seemed to echo back to me. After a while the hair-raising footsteps retreated and finally left my bedroom. I watched in horror as my door was quickly closed behind me. Terrified, I ran to my parents' bedroom, crying hysterically. I assured them that someone outer-worldly had entered my bedroom and had been standing over my bed watching me. My parents assured me it was my childlike imagination, and children were very good at creating scary pictures in their heads. I did not believe that for a moment. One night I was awoken up to someone shaking me very hard. At first I thought it was my mother waking me up for school, and I groaned, looking at her through my sleepy eyelids. But it was not my mother that I was observing, but someone else, whom I can only describe as a young woman dressed in 1800s clothes, who looked like a maidservant. "Sir, you must come now," came the disquieted voice. "Your son has fallen off his horse, and he's in a very bad way, sir. I think he may be dead. Come at once." I sat up in alarm as I looked at the earnest face of this young woman, who faded before my eyes and suddenly vanished. For some reason I was not afraid, but more mystified by this evocative, rather gripping experience. Even at such a young age, I was consumed and enthralled by that experience. The events seemed so surreal to me, but I was certain I had seen this ethereal, ghost-like girl, and when I told my mother about what had happened to me, I was surprised that she actually believed me. "I have seen that servant girl too," she told me, "running across our lawn in the middle of the night, looking frantic. I knew she was a ghost because she faded before my very eyes. It was the most spellbinding, transfixing thing that I've ever witnessed," she told me. Finally, I had my mother on board with me because she'd been seeing some curious, unexplained phenomena in our home as well, which meant she was less likely to dismiss me again should I have another supernatural encounter. So as irrational as it sounds, instead of feeling fearful about the strange, unearthly, abnormal events going on in our home, it would seem that my mother and I developed a startling passion and somewhat extraordinary intrigue and fascination for all things outlandish, outer-worldly and paranormal. Before long, my mother began to investigate the history of our home. We were to discover a newspaper article which read the following concerning the previous residents of our home, going back many generations. Mr. Bryke Lockwood was horse-riding with his brother George down a Berkshire country lane when George described seeing something so freakish that defies all natural explanation. It was a diabolical monster, he told the papers, standing upright on 2 legs, and it was about 7 foot tall and 3 feet wide, covered in dense, thick black hair. It had a hideously evil, grotesque-looking face, like that of a wolf or a savage dog, and it had very long, full tail, like that of a red fox. My brother and I stared at this demonical creature in utter horror, and it curled back its hideous mouth to expose its very sharp canine teeth, and it growled so viciously at us that the menacing, fiendish sound actually caused the ground beneath us to vibrate. I have never heard such a chilling, abhorrent sound like that before or since, he explained to the paper. It sent the fear of God into every fibre of my being. This creature looked like he had surfaced from the fire pit of hell itself, if there is indeed such a place. Upon seeing the creature, the horses bolted in terror, with the creature pursuing us from behind. My brother Bryce's terrified horse literally dashed under a tree, where the lower branches thrashed him off the horse so forcefully that he was plunged to the ground and killed on impact. On returning to the scene, it was discovered that Mr. Bryce's clothes had been shredded off his dead corpse by a very savage wild animal, and there were peculiar deep scratches embedded in his torso that the mortician described as coming from the claws of a very large animal of disproportionate size. These were different to the scratch marks received before death from the tree branches, she explained to the papers. I've never seen anything like them before. The claws that caused these scratch marks were quite literally like daggers. Could there be any truth to this very strange story, or was Mr. George Lockwood intoxicated from a little too much sherry at the time? Yet, if that were the case, what caused the mysterious scratch marks on Mr. Bryce Lockwood's corpse that has left the mortician, Dr. Powell, baffled and at a loss for words? If Mr. George Bryce's allegations do indeed have merit, is there really a wild beast roaming the Derbyshire countryside that would seem to be not of this world? Wow, I said to my mother. I now know why that maidservant was shaking me in the night to wake me up. She thought I was Mr. Bryce Lockwood's father and was waking me up to tell me about the horse-riding accident when George was flung to his death. That would explain why I saw the servant girl running frantically across the lawn, said my mother. She was trying to get help after Mr. Bryce's dreadful horse-riding accident. Poor thing. I think we may have been caught up in some kind of a time glitch, where the memory of a traumatic event is played back in our time. I've heard about that sort of thing happening before. It would seem that my mother and I began to become incredibly fascinated by the paranormal, and my mother would leave a recorder on in the house overnight, and the next morning we would pick up strange messages like, "Bryce is dead," "It was a monster," or "The horse bolted." Everything that we picked up on our recordings seemed to correlate back to the dreadful accident that killed poor Bryce Lockwood. Finally, it would seem when I was 10 years old, my parents returned home to North America, back to Seattle, where they're initially from, and we settled down to life in the city in a stunningly refurbished, modernised apartment that overlooked fabulous views of the city and the Space Needle. I attended a local school there, and I began to really enjoy my new life in North America, acquiring many new friends, as well as an American accent. Before long, my interest in the paranormal seemed to wane and dissipate, as I got caught up in the drudgery of everyday routines, such as after-school football practice and drama lessons. One day I began to hear creepy stories of a ghostly apparition that was seen by 3 different eyewitnesses in a forest in the Washington area, and when I told my mother about the sightings, our intrigue and bubbling passion for the paranormal was reborn. "Let's go to that forest at once," my mother enthused excitedly. "We can camp out there overnight. It'll be fun. And while we're in the area, we can interview some of the eyewitnesses and ask them exactly what they saw." I thought it was a fabulous idea, but my father scoffed at us and told us that our obsessive interest and exuberant enthusiasm for all things unseen bordered on the insane, and we were off our heads to want to go chasing after ghosts. Fast forward to a week or so, my mother and I had spoken to 3 different eyewitnesses who had spotted the apparition of a young woman seen in her nightgown rushing through the woods, but no one knew anything about her, or who she was, or how she died. Yet everyone gave a very poignant, similar account of the sighting that made the eyewitness reports seem very credible. She had long blonde, loose-flowing hair, we were told, fair skin, and wore a long nightgown, and she ran like the wind through the forest. It would seem that something or someone appeared to be terrorizing her as she kept looking behind her as if she was being chased. The expression on her face was one of utter terror. I'll never forget her petrified look. "Did she see you?" I remember asking. "No, she just ran, but I knew she was a ghost because she ran through a solid tree, and then she vanished." It was on a Saturday night when my mother and I hitched our tents up in an open clearing beside a silvery lake on the edge of these dreamy woods, consisting of mature, tall, imposing western hemlocks, Douglas firs, spruce, red alder and Pacific yew trees. It was a very exquisite location, and I knew that whether my mother or I witnessed the apparition of the young girl or not, at the very least we were in for having a very good time. "Your dad thinks we're both completely potty," my mother giggled, as we barbecued some steaks over the open grill and fire pit. "He says if we hadn't lived in that old house back in England, we wouldn't have become so obsessed by the paranormal." "He's probably right," I admitted. "I mean, after you've seen something like that you can't explain, it does have a way of arousing your curiosity and interest." "You can say that again," said my mother, looking excited. "Oh, I do so hope we see that spooky girl tonight. I wonder what on earth she's running from." "So do I said. "Oh, look," I said, pointing to the distance. "Look over there," I said excitedly. "There's some white-tailed deer over there, gathering at the water's edge to drink. They're so gentle and serene." "They most certainly are," sighed my mother happily. "It's so lovely out here. We should camp more often." That night we set our alarm clocks for about 12 p.m, because all 3 eyewitnesses claimed to have seen the apparition of the young girl in the forest at about 20 past 12. My mother and I retired to our sleeping bags and fell fast asleep, to the distant howls of coyotes, the chorus of crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl hoot. We were awoken to the sound of our buzzing alarm clocks, going off at about 12 o'clock. My mother woke me up eagerly. "Get up," she said. "We want to make sure we see the ghost of the girl, remember?" My mother was physically so excited that I had to literally calm her down. I think Mother was more of a kid than I was, because she was so flustered and enthusiastic about our nightly excursion of ghost hunting. "Mum, I don't want you to be disappointed if we don't see the ghost," I told her. "You can never guarantee these things." "I know, dear, but it's still so exciting looking for her in the dead of night like this." We put on our headlamps and, armed with our flashlights, a camera and a tape recorder, we ventured into the woods. "Whereabouts do you think the girl was last seen?" my mother asked. Suddenly we could both smell the most hideous odour that you could ever imagine, and it was so vile and repugnant, and smelt like seriously off meat or rotten eggs, and was burning our eyes and causing us to sneeze.
"What the hell is that?" whispered my mother, searching the woods with my spotlight and flashing my torch around to see if I could observe a dead animal, but I could see nothing there. "Something is watching us," whispered my mother. "Look over there." My mother was pointing towards a tree branch that was moving backwards and forwards, and I could swear I could see a black shadowy form lurking behind the tree. "I think it's a shadow person," I whispered to my mother, "and it seems to be interacting with us." My mother became animated, because it would seem we had discovered another ghostly apparition in the woods, and she was absolutely enthused. "Supposing it's the man that was chasing after the ghostly girl," she suggested. "Let's follow it," she urged excitedly.
As we moved towards the swaying trees, we suddenly heard the most terrible guttural growl, which was unlike anything I've heard before, and it sent shivers down my spine. I've never felt that afraid before. "It's a demon," whispered my mother in horror. "Let's get away from it. In all my research on ghostly apparitions, a ghost that growls is definitely demonic." As we moved away from the growling demonical being, suddenly we heard the most dreadful sound, like a massive animal charging through the bush, tearing towards us at a thunderous speed, and as it moved, it caused the ground beneath it to shake and vibrate. My mother and I started to run as fast as we could in the opposite direction from our tent, and we stopped for a moment to see if we could see the demonic entity that we thought was chasing us, but what we saw was so strange. For that moment we just stood paralysed and frozen to the spot like vast blocks of ice, immobilised by terror. Standing over 100 yards away from us was the hugest monstrous creature that I've ever seen. I mean, this thing was jumbo in size. It must have easily been 10 foot tall, possibly more, and at the very least 1,000 pounds, and approximately 5 foot wide. Forget these measurements. This thing was hectically huge and powerfully intimidating, and it possessed a very hostile demeanour towards us. It glared and glowered at us with such an intense hatred, loathing and revulsion, a look that I could see emanated fiercely from its aggressive, hostile red eyes. I could tell that it was covered in coal-black long hair, and it was built like an army tank. It was that burly. I noticed that every area of this critter's body literally bulged with muscle that would have intimidated the strongest man in the world, I promise you. My mother and I afterwards were pretty sure that this thing could have easily lifted up a car in its bare hands, as if it was just a toy. There are no words to describe to you the strength, power, and might of this extraordinary creature. I observed that this beast possessed these humongous-sized shoulders, the likes of such I've never ever seen before, and very overlong arms, and powerfully strong, sturdy legs, and a very distinctive cone-shaped head. I could not believe what I was actually seeing. The creature growled at us and rolled back its mouth to reveal very large, jagged, human-like teeth that glistened menacingly under the light of our headlamps, and then it began to make the most gut-wrenching roar that would easily make a lion's roar almost seem like a pussy-cat, and I'm not exaggerating. Even the trees shook under the vibration of this monstrous beast, and especially when it made that raucous, ungodly sound. My mother screamed at the top of her lungs as this thing came charging towards us. He grabbed my mother viciously and threw her to the ground like a baseball, but she got up and tore through the woods as fast as she could, and the creature was running fast behind us. I have never ever encountered such hostility and aggression before, but this creature, if he'd wanted to kill us, he could have done so in a heartbeat. I think he just wanted us off his turf, but let me tell you, I've never encountered such aggression before. Once we'd run through the forest, there was an open road and a farmhouse in the distance, so we ran over there and banged on the front door as hard as we could. We told the kindly farmer that something had chased us through the woods, and we were so terrified and too frightened to go back to our camping spot. We did not want to tell him about the ape-like humanoid in case he thought we were a couple of nutters, but we knew what we saw that night. "You are not the first to be chased out of those woods," said the farmer. "Believe me, I've heard some stories about those woods." He assured us that we were welcome to stay at their home overnight. The next morning he was good enough to accompany us back to our camping site, armed with his hunting rifle for our protection, so that we could gather all our belongings to go home. Imagine our immense surprise when we observed that all our things were scattered absolutely everywhere, all over the clearing, and our tent had been torn to shreds. I remember the farmer was so dumbfounded. He said to us, "Remind me to never hunt in these woods. What the hell did this to your tent?" He was absolutely horrified. Many, many years later, my mother and I learnt about the strange beast that we encountered in the woods was in fact a Bigfoot, and this creature put an end to our ghost hunting expeditions altogether because it frightened the living daylights out of us and put us off ghost hunting for good. My mother believes that the ghostly apparition in the woods may have actually been running away from this horrible monster, but we don't know how long ago she was killed, but it's a very likely scenario or possibility. Anyway, that's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Rachel, and my Bigfoot encounter happened when I was about 13 years old in 1993, and had such a profound dramatic effect on my life that it even influenced the direction of my life path in later years. I'm now a firm, staunch believer that there is no such thing as coincidence in this world, and that my interaction with this extraordinary creature was not an act of random chance, but a part of the great universal grand design and divine plan of the rich, vibrant tapestry of our human experience that I believe was clearly mapped out for me, possibly before I was even born. I believe we're all here to have a human experience in our physical bodies, and that our life paths lead us to those experiences that are often propelled by the life choices we choose to make and the roads we embark upon. In my opinion, nothing is ever an accident, because whether an experience turns out to be good or bad, inevitably we are being chiselled and moulded to become the very best versions of ourselves, and the unique individuals
that we were clearly ordained to be. The more we spiritually evolve as human beings, the more enlightened, compassionate and loving we invariably become. Well, that's my belief anyway. I grew up in West Virginia with my older brother Nicholas and my younger sister Kate, and we grew up in an idyllic rural location not too far from the town of Charleston, and we lived in an exquisitely picture-perfect log cabin nestled in the heart of the emerald green valley and surrounded by a backdrop of the most gorgeous panoramic mountainous views and dreamy forests that literally stretched back for miles. I considered myself to be the luckiest girl in the entire world to grow up in such an extraordinary, beautiful, idyllic, heartwarming and magical place. My two siblings and I would spend the hot summer days cooling down in the woods, where the canopy of large trees would block out the heat of the day and allow just enough sun to dapple the forest floor in a very pretty light. I would play with my two siblings in the woods for hours on end, and we would play games like hide and seek, or even kick a ball around in the open clearing, and it was always the best place in the world to search for Easter eggs or to have picnics during the summer. We were fortunate because there was a gorgeous stream that prevailed through the woods with a swift, forceful current that was surrounded by very large, imposing rocky boulders that were so magnificent that they looked like large works of art, and some were covered with beautiful layers of green moss. My all-time favourite spot to frequent in the woods was the enchanting rock pool with its imposing gushing waterfall, and as kids we would swim in that clear water almost every day during the summer months, often joined by other local kids who thought the woods on our land were like a piece of heaven. Naturally, living in this idyllic part of the world, we were exposed to the indigenous wildlife, and as invariably with such a great water supply meandering through the woods, it did attract a large deer population, including the inevitable raccoons and squirrels. It would seem that nobody hunted in our family, and I believe the animals saw our property as a safe retreat. Growing up, my mother stayed at home taking care of us and manning the fort, while my father worked in Charleston as a banker. One day when I was about 13 years old, I remember my brother and sister were doing their homework in the kitchen under my mother's supervision. As I'd finished my homework, I had some free time on my hands. It was a very sweltering hot day, and I decided I wanted to read a book. I remember it was an exciting mystery novel, and I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. But I decided I'd go and read it in the woods, because it was so refreshingly cool and breezy in there, and besides, I loved being outdoors. I grabbed a bottle of fresh spring water and a picnic rug, and off I went. I remember laying the picnic blanket underneath an oak tree, and I began to read my book. I took a sip of water and looked up from my book for a moment, and that was when I saw this huge pile of what I can only describe looked like an old dirty grey rug that was lying under this tree. I remember wondering who had thrown it out, and why they had tossed it in the woods like that. It was very peculiar because our land was private property, so I did not know of anyone who would be throwing nasty old rugs in the wood, unless there was a vagrant trespassing on our land, and this would not be the first time that had happened to us. I took another sip of water, and then I remember being almost convinced that the strange rug had curiously moved. Suddenly I was absolutely certain that there was someone sleeping under that dirty old rag. I knew my dad would not be happy to learn about another annoying trespasser that we would invariably have to chase off our land. Feeling more than a little cheesed off by this unwelcome visitor, I ventured towards the old smelly rug, and almost gagged because it smelt so disgusting and vile. I tugged the rug violently with my hands, and realised that the rug seemed to be attached to a living creature. I was completely gobsmacked and mesmerised at the same time. I could not imagine what it was, because it was large enough to be a bear, but this was clearly no bear, and it was too big to be a grey shaggy dog. I was very confused. Suddenly the creature looked up at me with what I can only describe as these bright yellow alluring eyes that peered at me through a sea of grey hair. On closer inspection, and to my utter amazement, I realised that this critter had human-like characteristics, but it wasn't human, and ape-like characteristics, but it wasn't an ape. I'd never seen, nor had I ever heard of a creature like this before, but whatever it was, it clearly needed me.
I could sense that the creature was so ecstatic to see me and seemed reassured by my presence, as if in some way I brought him a measure of great comfort. I could see the critter was beyond help. It was an elderly male, and I knew instantly that it was dying. I have been around dying animals enough in my young life, living so close to nature as I did, that I knew the imminent signs before me. I put my hand on the creature and stroked his hair tenderly, and the gratitude I witnessed on its face was immeasurable. I knew it did not want to be alone, as he lay there, and who could blame him? I sat beside him, putting my hand on his colossal, emaciated body and stroking him very gently. I could feel and sense his gratitude as he let out a few grunts under his breath. I began to sing to him very gently, and he seemed soothed by my voice. When he groaned in pain, he clutched an area of his body, and that was when I would massage the tender spot ever so lightly with my hands. I kept saying to him, "It's going to be all right, just you see. I promise you, it's going to be all right." I spoke to him in very gentle whispers. "It's going to be all right. Everything's going to be fine. I promise you. Don't you worry. Everything's going to be fine." I do not want to underestimate how Herculean this thing was. It was almost like I was stroking a rhino or a blue whale, something with an extensive surface area that had very titanic proportions. I could tell that the critter was suffering from extreme muscle wastage and was skeletal, scrawly, decrepit and weathered by the ravages of a very long life. I think he must have just suddenly passed out and stumbled under the tree where I found him, and his body began to shut down. I was so pleased to be with him in these last moments because his family possibly hadn't realised his impending fate. I imagine he was engaging in his usual routine and was struck down very suddenly, and as far as his family members were concerned, I imagine they were oblivious of his dramatic physical decline and deterioration. If they could not be there for him, at least I was. I remember grabbing the strange critter's hands, but they were so big that I could only squeeze a couple of his sausage-sized fingers, and when I did this, he made this very thankful grunt, as if I was reassuring him and watching over him. I know it sounds very odd, but I felt such a connection towards this creature. Possibly it was because of his humanness in the appearance, but somehow I felt such extraordinary love and compassion for him. This hairy humanoid opened its gorgeous golden eyes and looked at me with such incredible warmth. I kept reassuring him over and over again with soothing, calming words. I could feel the tears welling up in the back of my eyes, because I didn't want this extraordinary, unique and special beast to die. I think he sensed my shriveled, distraught emotions, because he reached out to touch me, as if to reassure me, which was so endearing that I was touched to the quick. I mean, this creature was dying for goodness sake, and it was actually trying to soothe me and calm me down. I opened my bottle of water and poured a little down its throat, which seemed to quench his dry throat, and he drank the cold liquid gratefully, all the while watching me with curious eyes. "I do not know what you are, or who you are," I told him, "but I know that you are very beautiful and very special, and I know that I shall never forget you as long as I live." I said this, cradling my body close to the creature's as if I'd known it all my life. "I may have only met you a second ago," I told him, "but I love you, and I always will." I knew he wanted me there, and I was so happy to be there for him. I put my hand on his thin, sinewy, expansive, broad chest, and I could feel the heart beating very slightly, like a battery that's running out of steam, and growing fainter and fainter and fainter by the second. I knew it wouldn't be long now before he finally breathed his last. I nudged the creature very gently and looked at him tenderly, and for a moment our eyes met. "It won't be long now," I said reassuringly. "Then you'll be going off to a wonderful, beautiful place." The creature grunted as if he understood my words, breathed his last, and finally he slipped away and died. I remember bursting into tears and shaking his body as violently as I could to try and wake him up and rouse him from his sleep, but he was well and truly deceased, and his body lay limp. I checked
His chest and his heartbeat had definitely stopped. So I ran back to the house, sobbing my heart out, inconsolable with grief, as if I had lost my best friend. My mother and brother could not get anything out of me, as I was so terribly upset. I remember my mother said, "Rachel, you're scaring me half to death. Has someone died?" I nodded my head and beckoned for them to follow me back into the woods, but when I returned to the place where I had discovered this extraordinary creature under that tree, his body had mysteriously been evacuated. It was utterly extraordinary, and I was so devastated. "It was here," I said. "A moment ago. It was here. I was here with it." "What was here?" my mother asked, looking mortified. "Rachel, you're scaring me. What was here?" I proceeded to tell them my strange, very peculiar story, and they both looked very perturbed. "Rachel," my mother said, "I've no idea what you saw, because I've never heard of such a creature before. But I'm glad you were there for it in its last moments. No one should ever have to die alone, human or animal." I remember hearing my brother say to my mother, "What the heck did she see?" "I have absolutely no idea," remarked my mother. "But I'll tell you this for nothing. I've never seen Rachel so emotionally stirred up by anything like this before. This event has impacted her life in such a dramatic way. You mark my words." My mother was right, of course. After my interaction with the critter in its dying moments, I was moved so much that I decided when I grew up, I wanted to become an EMT. I wanted to help people in harrowing emergency situations and be that reassuring voice for them, especially if they were in death and life situations. I now vehemently believe that the creature I encountered in the woods was, in fact, a Bigfoot. Fast forward a few years and I had trained as an EMT. I still remember the first day of my course as if it was yesterday. There were so many young people, equally as enthusiastic and eager to become EMTs as I was. We were all talking excitedly about the prospects of the job. I still remember the doctor coming into the room with a very sombre expression and telling us that he was going to show us a graphic video about life on the front line dealing with emergency situations, which he warned us was not for the faint-hearted. "Once you've seen the video, and you still want to be an EMT," he told us, "then and only then will I believe you. The job requires nerves of steel." He pointed to a pile of plastic bags. "If any of you need to throw up during the footage," he explained, "they're there for you." I remember thinking, what the heck? How could a video really be that horrific that we might actually need sick bags? Wasn't that not going a little bit overboard? The footage was worse than I could have ever envisaged, and we were eyewitness to the raw emotions, the screaming relatives, and of course all the grisly details of decapitated body parts, from shootings, car accidents, and of course suicides. We were shown details of the bodies in graphic detail, like the tissues, the blood, the goo, the brain matter, that had all been splattered across the road in an accident, like a box of broken eggs. It didn't get more graphic than that. I'm not going to lie to you and pretend I was all stoic and composed, because like most of the people in the room, I was actually throwing up violently and heaving in a sick bag. But if the video could not have got any worse, it invariably did, and we were seeing graphic scenes of EMTs being beaten up by drunks and physically assaulted in their jobs, which is part of the job description. And I watched all this with great trepidation. When the doctor finally returned back into the room, he asked us if anyone wanted to leave, and more than half of the potential applicants left at once, realising that they could never stomach a job in the front line. I remember the doctor smiling at us and saying, "You see why my job is so easy? Because now I know who's got what it really takes to do the job, without wasting my time with interviews." I think we were being shown this footage to see whether we had the grit and the steel to be able to deal with these challenging life and death situations, and I can assure you that nothing you could have said would have put me off becoming an EMT, because I was absolutely determined to follow what I believed was my life calling. I was to discover that being an EMT was such a rich, intimate experience for me, helping people in all kinds of scenarios, such as deadly car accidents, suicides, assaults, murders and shootings, and believe me, I saw it all. And even the video didn't do justice to what it really was like out there
in those harrowing life and death situations, because believe me, it's graphic, it's bloody, and it's horrendous. As is the case with every EMT, there is usually a story that they will never ever forget. And my special story I'd like to share with you and your listeners that I really believe affirms that there really is life after death. So here is my story. It all happened when I was called out to an area in Charleston at about 9 o'clock at night. It appeared that a very young woman had been shot in the leg by her fiancé, who claimed it had been a dreadful accident. When we arrived at their Charleston home, the boyfriend was so inconsolable with grief and was sitting on the porch crying. He kept saying, "It's my fault, it's my fault, it was an accident, please help her," he begged. I looked at the girl and she stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. "I'm so scared," she said. "I'm sure I'm going to die. Please, please, don't let me die." I remember my hands were shaking violently as I tied a tourniquet on her leg. I could see blood was spraying out of her femoral artery at an alarming rate. "You're going to be fine," I kept reassuring her, although in my gut I knew things weren't looking at all good. The whole patio floor was covered in pools of blood, and I know it sounds weird, but I could actually taste and smell the iron in the air. At this stage, my gloved hands were sliding and slipping all over the place from the blood, and my patient started slipping into unconsciousness as my partner was incubating her. I was tightening the tourniquet on her leg because the wound had not stopped bleeding. It was really out of control. Suddenly I heard this loud whooshing sound, which was so audible to me, and I kid you not, I saw the apparition of this woman slide out of her body, much like a card from an envelope. The next thing I knew was that she was seated on the ground, leaning over her body and staring down at herself. I remember she looked startled when she realized she was outside of her body, and she was watching us. She was surprised that we could actually see her. I will never forget her pleading expression on her face as we worked on her, trying to stop the blood flow. I really believe she wanted to live. I've never seen anything like this happen before, and I couldn't make any sense of it at all. Even my EMT partner witnessed this tumultuous event, and we kept working on the poor woman while she watched us so earnestly. But unfortunately we couldn't save her in time, because everything transpired way too quickly, and she'd lost far too much blood. Suddenly the apparition of the girl vanished before us, and we had to cover up her whole body with a sheet. I kept wondering if she was still watching us, and it sent chills down my spine because I could sense and feel her around us. "Life extinct," I said, 9:06 p.m. "Did you see that?" I asked my partner, shaking. "The girl was outside her own body. She was watching us." "Like hell I saw it," said my partner, looking at me with wide eyes. "We saw her ghost. She wanted to live, poor thing, but she's bled out so much we could never have saved her." Suddenly we saw the sobbing fiancé coming racing over to us. "What have you done?" he screamed, lashing out at me aggressively. "You let her die! You let her die! How could you? I trusted you!" He started slapping me very hard, in between violent sobs. "Sir," I said, "please sit down now. Calm down. I didn't kill your fiancé. I want to explain what happened. The bullet hit her femoral artery. She was bleeding out so fast, it was impossible to curtail the bleeding. There was nothing we could do, and the tourniquet was not working. I'm sorry, sir, but there was nothing we could do." "Oh, my God! What have I done?" said the fiancé. "It's my fault. It's my fault." "Now calm down," I said. "What happened? Do you remember?" I was showing my fiancé how to use the revolver. She's been stalked by a weirdo at work, and was certain this man was following her everywhere she went. I told her she needed to learn to use a revolver, and I kept going over and over what she needed to do, and I kept showing her over and over again. She really wasn't getting it easily. I began to show her the safety catch and how to pull the trigger. I kept repeating it, because she just couldn't get it into her head how to do it. I was pulling the trigger several times during my demonstration, and the one time when I failed to use the safety catch, the rifle unloaded in her leg. It was an awful mistake. I tried to calm the man down, but he didn't seem to be able to be calmed, because he was in such a terrible state. Later, I watched him being led away by the police because they had to take him for some interrogation, because obviously he had actually shot her, so he was the prime suspect. Do you really think it was an accident? I asked my partner. Who knows, he said. It's a funny old world, the things that happen out here. They boggle the mind. I wonder if people would believe some of our stories. Probably not, I laughed. I sincerely doubt it. What do you think about the apparition we just saw? I asked him. I think it's proof beyond question that life beyond death really exists, he said. I do not believe we actually die. We live on. So there you are. That's my story. I just want to say that that was the most incredible, incredible story. And I just want to thank you so very much for sending it to us and letting us really understand, Rachel, what it is like to be an EMT on the front line. That story of that girl being outside of her body, looking down on herself, and you actually physically seeing her apparition is shocking. That really is quite something. That must have been very harrowing for you and very traumatic. And as for your encounter with the Bigfoot in the woods, I'm just so grateful that you had the courage and the strength to literally calm that creature down. A lot of people wouldn't have had that amount of courage. But you chose to calm that creature down in its dying moments. And I think when you went back to look for it, it had clearly been taken away by its loved ones who clearly discovered it deceased. It obviously lived a very long life, but you were able to literally tune in to its energy, and it appreciated that so very much. Because I agree with your mother. I don't think anybody would want to die alone. And I think we have an enormous amount in common with Bigfoots. Yes, you do get very aggressive ones out there, but this one was very, very amenable and very congenial. And what a wonderful encounter.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.